They saw the first shadow at dusk over the stepstones, and the fishermen cried that a second sun had come to fall into the sea. It was no sun. It was a wheel of black fire, beating its way out of cloud like a heart torn from the chest of night, and the light that spilled from its throat etched the wave crests to knives. Their little boats became mice before a beaked hawk. Nets smoked and snapped. A cod deck wriggled against a deck plank as if trying to leap back into water already boiling away from the flame that stitched across it. And when the flame died, steam lifted in long white exhalations, as though the earth itself had sighed. By morning, stories washed against Blackwater Bay like driftwood. Tyrion heard them where he always heard stories now, at the council table, with a cup of watered wine too far from his hand to pretend he reached for it without plotting to drink more than he ought. A gull pecked at mortar in the window slit, tapping like a knock from a smaller world beyond the world. He ignored it. The master of whisperers, how he missed having one worth the name, had sent a boy who had swum to a rock while his father's boat burned, and the boy's eyes had gone like wet coal at the memory. It spoke, the boy said, or so the guard who translated his island patter claimed. It spoke, and the sea caught fire wherever its words fell. Spoke? Bronn said, drawing the word out as if it might be a fish he could gut and salt. He lounged in his chair, lordling's rings clacking on the wood as he flicked them with a lazy thumb. A dragon speaks now. Next you'll tell us it's paying taxes. Dragons always speak, said Samwell Tarly, who wore the chain of Grand Maester with the same sheepish care he had once worn his Night's Watch cloak. Only not in tongues we can repeat. It's fire. Fire that remembers the shape of words. He pushed his spectacles up his nose and blinked at Bran the King, as if waiting for correction. Bran did not correct him. Bran seldom spoke first, but when he did speak, people fell over their own tongues to stop talking. He sat with the patient uprightness that made even the chair look humbled. His gaze drifted through a window that held the last of morning like milk at the bottom of a cup. Were there ravens in those pale eyes, or only the sky? 3 shadows, Bran said. No, 4. His voice came from far away, which was to say it came from wherever he had sent it. Tyrion envied that trick. It meant he didn't need to be in King's Landing at all. 4, Davos repeated. The one that spoke, and 3 that learned to listen. He rubbed a thumb along the grain of the table where old maps had scarred it. If the big one's the same as before, he's older, and the little ones will be hungry. The city is still rebuilding, Brienne said. Her sword leaned against her chair, ready as breath. It was not her worry for stone that carried in the words. We can move the people from the riverfront, if it comes here. If it meant to take King's Landing, it would have done it last night. Tyrion lifted his own cup at last and found it empty. It flew past 700,000 ready meals and chose to roast fish. This is a nesting. They're making for Dragonstone. Why? Bronn's tone was bored, which in him was the same as hungry. What do dragons want besides meat and sunlight? Tyrion didn't say to lay claim to a ghost. He said, home. Even beasts know where their bones ought to fall. When the meeting ended, he took the long way down to the yard, partly to feel stone underfoot instead of argument, partly so he could pause by the place where the Iron Throne had stood and watch the slanted light sifting down from the dust-choked high windows. Sun motes turned in lazy constellations. A potter's will scrape somewhere, a far sound in a place meant for nearer noises. Panic, triumph, monarchs naming names. The last throne had gone to a bright puddle of black iron and bitter memory under Dragonfire a lifetime ago measured in weeks, and the scars in the floor where it had fused and cooled still rippled under his soles. He knelt and set his palm against it. The stone was not cold. Exactly. Elsewhere, a gull cried and was answered by another, and he thought, if he sweeps into the hall again, if he looks for the shape he melted and cannot find it, will he be angry with us for taking away something he hated? The gulls followed the great shadow north, for there was always food where doom traveled. The shadow flew over the salt pans and the Duskendale fields where the wheat this year stood up to the belly of a small man. It cast a moving night on river and farm and the children who ran out to point and be pulled back by hands that shook. In the vale, it showed as a bruise passing along the mountain face. In Storm's End, boys with new-made mustaches strung bows they did not need and pretended they could touch it. On Dragonstone, the caves breathed heat of their own, the earth remembering dragons as a lover remembers a hand, and the shadow came down out of the margin of sky to meet the mountain that had always waited. He came like a comet unfurled, and the mountain answered with its long subterranean growl. He landed where the old bones in the old pit were red earnestly as rust and black as cathedral night, and his feet dug furrows that quickly filled with the shine of cooling glass. He folded his wings with a whisper, and the whisper rattled through the Dragonmont and scattered 1,000 sleeping bats into dance. The brood came after him, coughing with effort, delighted with their own smoke. One was the color of sea-wet coal and glinted blue along the pinions when the light caught it. One had a smattering of ash-gray freckles along a hide more brown than black. The smallest had a greenish slick to the scales, oil on storm water, with a laugh that sounded like a bellows misused. And one, though calling it smallest, would have been an eye. Insult it might remember in flame, was red as a brand, with a blaze down its spine that some old tongue might have called a sigil. He touched each with the side of his jaw. The red pressed back too hard, snapped lightly at his chin, then leaped in a bound that spilled rock from a ledge. He hissed and gathered with a sweep of neck, and they settled, chastened and proud, coils sliding in the place where other dragon coils had slept and hissed, had hooked their claws into stone and left marks that no manner of wind could smudge. The mountain spoke again, a comforting old man's cough. He lowered his head to smell the dust. There were ghosts here. They smelled of hot blood and iron, of girls who sang to them, of men who tried to put chains on them, of bones and old smoke, and something that might have been laughter in the long ago. Across the water in King's Landing, bells that had learned to hate themselves for how easily they rang in surrender now told the hour of an ordinary morning. It had been a miracle to find ordinary again, thin but persistent as grass through masonry. Bakers grumbled at the cost of flour and made pastries that listed a little at the edge. Little boys sharpened sticks into swords and were only told to stop when a mother needed a hand to carry kindling. Tyrion watched a mason adjust a plumb line and thought, "This is the true throne." He let that comfort last 7 heartbeats, then took up a pen. The raven for Winterfell flew with the first breeze that began to smell of rain. Sansa read it in a window seat, while beyond the glass the clouds pulled long cowls over the shoulders of the moors. She put the letter down, leaned her head back against the stone, and shut her eyes. The breath she let out was not a sigh. It was a measurement. She was always measuring now, a habit the North had taught her and sorrow had perfected. Brienne waited without urging, knowing the look of thought when she saw it. When Sansa looked up again, the light in her eyes had sharpened. "We move the herds farther into the hills," she said. "We will not give the dragons a reason to believe the North is their pantry." Her hand smoothed the letter flat with careful fingers. "And we call a moot, not the full banners, the ones whose advice is worth my time. Send for Manderly, Serwyn, Glover, Liber. The mountain clans will send who they send." "A moot," Brienne repeated with a nod. "For war, for winter," Sansa said. "Or what looks like winter when you see it from the pylons of the Red Keep." She smiled very faintly. "I remember what a dragon looks like from beneath. It always looks like winter." Bran's raven reached Jon later still, because the North beyond the North is a place where even birds sometimes think twice. Jon stood with Tormund where the trees thinned into the wide white, where the sky is an old man's eyebrows and the snow is a conversation you are always interrupting. Ghost pressed his flank against Jon's knee and snuffed steam that billowed and broke. Tormund read the letter upside down, because he said words were easier that way. "For little ones," he said, with the tone he'd once used for 4 casks of good ale, and 4 sisters who could wrestle a bear, and the big black, the angry lad who took your girl away. He stopped, half in jest, half out before he stepped on grief. "It brought her somewhere that was not here," Jon said, "and it was not answer enough, and it was all the answer the air would take." His hand found the fur at Ghost's neck and dug past it until the beast leaned harder with pleased weight. "If it's nesting at Dragonstone, it will hunt. The old stories are full of sheep that turn to fire and shepherds who become stories for their wives to tell without smiles. The small council will build more scorpions. We'll get a war out of it, or it will be called peace while it eats. Tormund squinted at the white. What do you want to do, Crow? Jon looked up and saw only sky. He thought, not for the first time, that men would be more bearable if they learned to look up more often and say fewer clever things. The sky held a smear of darker movement at its seam, a bruise making itself, and for a foolish heartbeat he thought it was winter making new weather, and then the bruise detached and came on wings. It was not the big one. It was hardly big enough to cast a clean shadow. Its shadow fluttered like a torn banner. It came down crooking its wings, misjudged the wind, and skidded clumsily along the top of the drift in a hiss of snow turned to fog. Ghost leaped and pinned it without sinking teeth. Jon was faster with his hand than with his fear. He reached Ghost's ruff and said a word that was no word in any language but theirs. The little dragon writhed and came up snarling, and the snarl broke into a cough. Steam and smoke streamed from its nostrils as if it had caught too much cold. Its eyes were pearls with coals in the heart of them. It made a sound that was not quite threat and not quite question and swung its head at Jon with reckless, lost grace. He had the stupid vision of it cracking that delicate skull against his knee as a puppy might do, and in the same breath he knew that if it broke any bone today, it would be his. He offered his hand, curled back its lip and snapped over the fingers. The teeth just touched skin. The heat of its breath was the heat of living rock. Ghost waited, lowering his head, good dog, wise and unoffended, which offended the dragon's pride. It tried to puff itself into a size the air would believe in, failed and sneezed cinder. If you're a messenger, Jon said to it, you've come a long way and are a poor one. It did not understand words. That wasn't how understanding worked. But something in his voice, or in his smell, or in the stubborn stillness of a man who had learned under 1,000 eyes to hold his ground, made the dragon ease. It bobbed, jerked, bobbed again, then came forward in a motion both sly and foolish, and rubbed the side of its face along his wrist where the veins beat. He could feel the small plates of its scales under the membrane. He could feel its heart, frantic and earnest. Tormund laughed his bear laugh, big enough to make the trees shrug. Look, he said, delighted. You found yourself a lizard that's decided it's a hound. I'd rather it decide I'm not food, Jon answered. The dragon made another of its frustrated bellows. It was thin, too thin. Its belly was not the proud hanger a healthy animal has, and one wing had 3 rents where ice had cut it. Another winter would eat it, or wolves would study how fear tasted when roasted. Jon looked back toward the line of trees and saw in the far distance a darker smear. Another bruise, a promise. I'll take it south, he said. Tormund rolled his shoulders. I bring a dragonling to a city where men make importance out of lifting their cups. If you were any other man, I'd call it folly. But you are you, and so I call it you. They rigged a sled with old reins and better hope. Ghost ran in harness with the insulted gravitas of a lord-turned cart horse. The dragon watched the harnessing and pretended not to be fascinated by leather. It was the pretense of a creature that would always be more honest than men. When the sled jolted into motion, it spread its wings, overbalanced, and tumbled into a heap that left prints like a child's hand pressed hard into snow. Jon knelt and set his hands on the edge of the wing and showed it how to fold the limb so the wind would not catch. It snapped at him once more on principle, then went along with the indignity of rescue. He grinned despite himself and did not try to hide it. Storm's End watched a storm come in that was not weather. Gendry Baratheon stood on the battlement with his hand on the black stone and counted breaths between lightning. Apprentices swarmed below like beetles with hammers, bolting together the scorpions he had sworn to hate as a craftsman and to admire as a lord. He had not been born to such sums, but he could keep them. A dragon that could come out of any sky requires a thing that can turn whatever sky into a killing ground. He wanted to throw every iron limb into the sea and watch rust take them like forgiveness. He wanted his people to sleep without dreaming of ash. He felt the wants meet and part like a wave around his shins. The horn sounded from the outer gate, high and a hair off true. He knew the sound of every man who blew a warning as he knew the sound of every hammer that struck his keep. This horn said 3 ships had come out of a rain that was not usual rain, and on the second ship there was a sign painted in fresh black, a wolf with eyes pricked like candles. "Let them in," he said. "If they carry trouble, we have it already. If they carry news, it will come whether we stand our ground or run to the far edge of it." Arya Stark did not look as if she carried news. She looked as if she had slipped off a painting and come to check whether anyone in the hall was being honest. She leaned a hip against a pillar as if it might try something. Rain had found her hair and marked her clothes in coins. When she smiled, it made men step backward and women lean forward, and both were wise. "Nice toys," she said, nodding at the half-assembled scorpions. "Useful toys," Gendry said, and her smile pressed all the way down into a truce. "I came across the narrow sea by way of no such thing, and when we crossed the stepstones, something lit the water beside us and all the fish in it. I thought of the hound and of a man who fell with a sound that wasn't a sound. I thought of flying. I thought of how I don't like it." She shrugged, as if to throw off the memory to the floor where it could be swept up later. "The stories are true again. They do that. In the morning, when the storm thinned to a gray net that let shapes through, they saw a darkness resting on the water far beyond the bay. It was not a ship. It was too still to be a cloud. It made the horizon look like a mouth closing." "He's not here for us," Arya said. "He remembers where we live, but he remembers where he lives more. He'll hold to Dragonstone until somebody gets clever and pokes him." "Clever," Gendry said, with all the affection built into a good insult. "Have you come here because you hope to see me be that?" "I came to see if you'd built the gallows you swore you wouldn't, and to tell you not to stand under them when you pull the rope. What would you have me do?" "The thing you do best." She tipped her head toward his hands, big and nicked and honest. "Make a promise into a thing you can put weight on. In Old Town, men who liked to believe that the world was a set of drawers discovered that a new drawer had been slid into their tidy cabinet when they were not looking. The glass candles burned when they did not expect them to, and when the Archmaester who had declared them folly turned away in his chair, his reflection in the glass showed him with a crown of black twists perched on his white hair. He blinked and sent an acolyte to put out the candle. The boy could not. The boy's wrists shook with the effort, and the flame leaned and set free a small drip of light that rolled to the lip and fell and did not fall, hanging as a jewel in the air. The boy looked at it until his eyes watered and then burst into tears that were relief and terror together. The Archmaester considered the tears, the jewel, the drop that had not dropped, and thought of 6 chapters he had written on how the Age of Wonder was a poor storyteller's crutch and a tyrant's favorite gift, and he pressed the heel of his palm into his eye and saw, not darkness, but red. A horn in Old Town sounded, calling the brethren to debate. Red means blood to any man who has cut his finger. To a maester it also meant decisions, taken too quickly, and he snapped his book closed and went to them all the same. He stood before men who had kept their chains through war and famine and dragons and the weight of their own steps, and he said, "We will not blow horns. We will ring none. If you stir old magic with a horn on a day when dragons fly, the only ear you catch is theirs." "Old wives' tales," said a thin man with ink on his hands and little on his conscience. "You old wives have always wanted to believe. The man who says old wives has never seen an old wife," the Archmaester said, and smiled without joy. "Keep your horns. Fasten your doors. Come dawn. We will count every book we've forgotten we lost." He sent another bird to the capital. The ink froze twice on the quill and had to be breathed on to flow. At Dragonstone, the mountain flexed and sent up a burp of old fumes as if to say it was thinking, give it a moment. The hatchlings learned rock and then they learned wind. The black-blue glint one was best with the wind. A winged skater whose turns left no mark but a wake of new hunger. The ash-spattered one took to rock with an engineer's pleasure. It set its claws into faces any other creature would have read as no path and made a path, and then showed it to its red sibling with the triumphant snarl of a child who had moved a stool closer to a jar of honey. The green-slick smallest made best friends with heat, curling around vents no human body could have abided and sleeping with an expression that was an insult and a love letter both. And the great black watched and made no sound, and thought thoughts a man might have called memory if he had not been a man. He remembered the press of a small hand against his lip and a smell like hot sugar and salted tears. He remembered a voice that was not wind but spoke as wind speaks to leaves and sails. He remembered a knife inside a room that should have been all fire and was, and the meat of a soft chest turning to vast quiet. He remembered taking that meat where no one could offend it again. He remembered the shape of the world over water, the old cities that were bones with the fat and laughter gone, the place where earth's skin cracked and revealed its red veins and said, "Here I am, I too am alive." He remembered another smell, the smell of a man whose blood carried a taste his mouth knew as a song it had sung in an egg. If he had been a man, he would have called it kin. He was not a man. He had no words, but fire remembers. 3 days after the mountain took him in, a fleet appeared off Dragonstone distant as teeth in a mouth that did not want to bite but had learned to. Davos watched the ships through a device he had always said made him seasick merely to look through. The sails were royal colors. Davos had built some of the ships and had taught men to stand on their decks without swearing the whole time. It was a mean kind of pride, and he took it anyway. "We could have gone with fewer," he muttered. "All this wood offers itself up like a burnt supper. If we bring axes, they will bring flame." Tyrion stood with his elbows propped, his mouth making a thin line he had learned as a child. The line of a boy who knows his father has read his mind and not liked it. "We come in peace and benches," he said. "It will look like an invasion because everything we do looks like an invasion to someone. Perhaps do not say that in the speech you plan to give with one hand and a haunch of goat in the other," Davos suggested. "Perhaps," Tyrion said, which was as much as he would grant any advice he had already meant to follow. They went in a small boat because no man who means to talk with a dragon man survives the approach in a big one. Tyrion's knees did not bend as once they had. They sat with the ache you learned to call a companion when you had had more seasons than you had thought you would. Davos rowed. Brienne stood in the stern with her sword at ease and her eyes half closed against glare, doing a knight's good trick of taking in every threat by pretending to take in none. The shore stank as shore always does, a stew of rot and salt that is simply life at a different address. The mountain's breath added sulfur, a priest's curse on top of a farmer's dinner. Heat came off the rock in sheets. Tyrion's hair went damp and stayed. He had been here before with purpose and a bottle and dreams that had gone to sleep standing on their feet. He had been here with a queen. He had not been here with his last best plan. They saw it from 100 yards, the dark like a cave that had taught itself to fly. It lay across the entrance to the old pit and let its wing hang in the doorway like the curtain of a tent. The hatchlings were spread around it like a court, or like a bouquet of knives. At their scent, the hair inside Tyrion's nose crisped. He blinked tears and lifted the haunch of fresh-killed goat he had balanced on his knees. "Be careful," Davos murmured without looking at him. "Always," Tyrion said, and wondered if that was why he never was. They came as far as a man might come. The heat carried back the taste of cooked air, a sweetness that filled the mouth before it could be named. The biggest lifted its head first, which was a mercy. The little ones would have flown first and been less patient with disappointment. Its eye was an old coin withdrawn from circulation and still warm somehow in your palm. It blinked. When it did, the membrane came across like a curtain drawn on a play you did not know whether you wanted or not. The nostrils flared. The throat lifted as if it might be speaking, and to one side the red hatchling made an ardent sound as if volunteering to interpret. "We come with meat and manners," Tyrion said to the nostrils. "One of those things you understand. The other I will trust the gods to translate." Brienne's palm came to rest lightly on his shoulder. It was not a warning. It was a pledge that if his bones turned to chalk, she would carry the chalk home. Davos had a knife in one hand that could not possibly matter and a song in his head he would never sing again, because Melisandre had taken it from him along with a father and a child. Tyrion lifted the haunch of goat with both arms extended, as if he were a priest at a sillier altar than most, and walked forward. He made himself walk and not scuttle, and this was a victory fit to be sung. He made himself keep his head up. He heard his father's voice telling him that fear had a smell, and that a Lannister's fear should smell like another man's last chance. He raised the meat, and the dragon that had once flown under a queen bent and took it with the care of a large animal that has learned how fragile meat can be. The breath that washed over Tyrion was old summer. He closed his eyes. It slid along his cheeks and dried his tears, and it could have been a killing. It leaned and hummed, and he felt something that was not his own memory, that had no place in a man, slide across him like a shadow. He saw a room in which iron had run into a river and cooled. He saw a night over a winter sea that had never seen day. He saw a man with a face he had ordered hanged and then reprieved staring up into air full of wings. He opened his eyes and looked up at that air and said hoarsely, "Do not burn us. We are old. We are not worth your old hate." The dragon breathed out again. Fire did not come. Behind Tyrion, something shifted. It was a human something, a clatter of impatience disguised as courage. A red-robed priest who had not been invited had climbed the rocks like a crab and now flung up his arms and cried in a Free City tongue too poetic for the moment. His mouth was full of sunlight. He held up a brand. The brand burned bright. He lifted it, glory bent and naked. The smallest dragon darted. It was nothing like the dignified intake by which its elder had accepted the goat. It was a child's swipe. The brand went flying, landed against a slick patch of algae, and sizzled out with a petulant smoke. The priest shouted. He shouted again in a language that might have been his mother's. While he shouted, the ash-spattered hatchling swatted him soundly with its tail, and he went down hard and rolled twice, then lay blinking at the sky like a man wakened rudely from sleep. "Not gods," Tyrion said, in a voice half prayer and half lecture. "Not toys, not a throne, not a stable. They are themselves. Let us first do the courtesy of believing them." The next ravens flew and flew, and half were shot out of the air by boys in fields who had been told to do that to foxes. News reached the riverlands around the same time as the dragon shadows did, and men with memories of burned thatch found in themselves the strange envy with which the miserable can watch majesty and feel the magnitude of being alive. In the Vale, where stone makes stubborn people and stubborn ideas, an old knight coughed into a handkerchief and saw flecks of red and thought of how little he had ever meant beside certain larger things. In Dorne, where the waterkeepers keep their patients in jars in cool rooms, a girl broke a carafe not because she was frightened, but because she was excited and cursed the dragon who had made her uncareful and then laughed. It was not the laughter of rebellion or war. It was laughter as old as when a child stands under a sky and sees for the first time that a leaf is bigger than an ant. The Iron Islands tried to spit at the sea and discovered, as ever, that the sea spits back with interest. Yara Greyjoy stood on a cliff that had taught 1,000 men to fall and watched the first thing since silence big enough to scare her. Scorpions had been raised on swivel mounts atop towers built only to bear them, and the crews had trained until their fingers had blisters that had turned to callus. The dragons came with a contempt that was art. The red hatchling learned how a bolt moves through the air and saw that in the time it takes the thump to follow the twang, you can be elsewhere. The black-blue learned the same lesson and added a flourish. It banked and came down out of a sun that had troubled itself to break out of cloud just then, and a ballista caught light on its metal frame and blinded its own crew. Flame followed. The great black watched until one bolt found the green slick smallest and went through the wing with a sound like a flag tearing. And then he fell upon the tower as if he had at last met an enemy worth his time. Later, Yara would say she had never seen anything die with such dignity as that tower, which did not bend or splinter but simply ceased to be tower and became the idea of ruin. When it was done, and the scorpions were impressively stupid firewood, Yara spat into the sea and it returned the spittle to her boots. She laughed and swore and went to a boy who had lost 3 fingers and told him he would learn to like rum well enough. In private, where no one but 2 good knives and a flask could hear, she said to her dead uncle that he had called storms and this was what a real one looked like, and she asked the drowned god to go on drowning whoever thought to rise against this. The small council sat longer each day now. You could feel the city understand it the way a dog understands when its house has begun to listen harder to an illness. The tone of the market altered. Copper sounded like a question when it hit the scales. Gossip broadened its shoulders, became rumor, became prayer. Sam read out another report from Old Town about candles. Horns, a man who had thrown up when a book had moved itself to another shelf. If the world is coming back to itself, he said, we ought to have it on good terms about it. We'll make a pact, Tyrion said dryly. Man and magic, a compact. We'll meet them where we always meet anything that frightens us. At a table with bread and salt and a parchment whose ink we hope will not fade before we do. We will make a pact, Bran said, but not with magic, with hunger. They sent for Jon. He came down through the gift and over the neck as a man comes down from a mountain and finds himself taller not because he is taller but because the world has changed around him. Ghost carried himself with an insulted dignity that said long distance was for lesser wolves. The dragonling rode half the time in harness, half the time on the wind with a flustered arrogance that took strength from the way air itself bent to make room. At the twins, there was a new bridge that looked like a man trying not to pretend to be the old one. Jon walked across it with the light steps of a man who has learned to make peace with the ghosts of woodmen. At the crossroads, an innkeeper with too big a heart for her chest gave him a bowl of stew and said her son had seen a shadow and sworn off fishing. And Jon clasped her hand and said the boy might yet learn that shadows could be teachers if you went under them with the right hat. At King's Landing, he went where he had once gone to be judged and to judge himself. Tyrion met him in a small room with narrow windows and a decanter that looked as if it had been trying since morning to seduce him, and for once had not succeeded. They both smiled like men who have seen too much of each other's lowest and made peace with it as a kind of kinship. Do you still get the itch to run away to some little place and make a life that doesn't look you in the eye? Tyrion asked, pouring watered wine and handing Jon a cup he forgot to drink. It went away, Jon said, and then, because honesty was a habit that had cost him too much to abandon, it never goes away. We have a job for a man like that, Tyrion said. We have a country like that. Jon's dragonling had grown in the way boys do when they've been starving and then find a kitchen. Its wing knit with awkward new bone. It had taken to fishing in the Blackwater with a triumphant viciousness that terrified gulls and delighted children who couldn't be kept from the piers. Tyrion had gone down to watch, huddled in his cloak, and had seen a little girl clap her hands as a fish bigger than she was came down with a slap that splashed everyone in a 3-yard arc. He had watched her mother pretend to scold and then tuck one wet curl behind the little ear with the gentleness that makes a man's throat ache. He'd thought, this is what we forget. Wonder makes a better barricade than fear if you can build enough of it. Jon brought the dragonling to the yard. It stood with its head tilted sideways, taking in the city that had learned to be a ruin and then a project. Its eyes shone oddly when it watched the kiln at the brickworks. There was recognition in them, as if it smelled something that carried an accent it spoke at birth and had not heard since. The great black shadow did not come near the walls, and that had been a gift or a warning, and everyone took it as both. Go to Dragonstone, Tyrion said, and it was not a command. Carry our words to the big one. Take your little one. Take Davos and not me, because if we send all our cleverness at once, we will have none left to run the numbers and cheat them in our favor. Tell it the truth, that we cannot kill it without killing too much else, that we will not be its pantry, that we will feed it if it does not feed on us. Offer goats, offer cattle, offer the free use of a sky over the stepstones for burning ships with flags that aren't ours. We'll offer it work, Jon said. Tyrion's laugh was all warmth and ache. Yes, who could refuse a job with no master? They sailed with a wind that remembered old banners and made the sailcloth snap like old oaths. Davos loved and hated the hull beneath his feet as a man loves and hates an old friend who embarrasses him with memory. Jon stood at the prow and let the spray mark his cheeks with salt he did not wipe away. The dragonling rode the air in a series of jubilant misjudgments. When Dragonstone's bulk rose out of the water like a fact carved in basalt, the wind turned traitor and went sideways. Davos swore softly, and Jon braced his legs and thought, not for the first time, that the sea makes mock of even men who know it well. The great black waited. The brood arranged itself in a far more solemn half-circle than any meeting of lords had ever been, as if theater pleased them. Jon put his palm on the dragonling's neck and felt the thrumming inside the muscle. He did not bring meat. He brought nothing but his hands and his voice and a face the big one might remember. That was reckless. Reckless does not always mean wrong. He left Davos at the boat with a look that was thanks and contingency both. He climbed the rock until his thighs burned and then burned enough to drive out all lesser thoughts. He stood at the edge of the pit, and the heat on his face was a father's palm and a forge and a sun in a cavern. The dragon did not lower his head. He did not make it easy. Jon stood there and let the memory of another cavern flood him and leave him still standing. He did not bow. He did not take his sword because a sword is a lie in some places. "I came to say the things you already know," he said at last. "You know we will die if you want us to. You know we will fight you because that is what we do. You know we will hurt you if we can. And you know I cannot carry another weight like that. Not another world on my hands. It will break me and then it will break everyone. So I am asking." He swallowed and let his voice come up out of a chest that had learned how to carry everything it hates. "Take what you want from the men who stole people. There are 1,000 islands that hide slavers and pirates and call it trade. Hunt them so well that the children sleep in the free cities without hearing chains. Take the sky over water. Take Ragenstone and what you can carry in your claws. Leave the fields. Leave the cities. We will feed you. We will do it because fear cannot keep peace. Hunger can. If you agree, we will put it in words. I will stand for those words." The dragon made a sound. It was enormous and queerly soft, like breakers over old stones. The sound went into Jon's bones and found the place where he had put a name and shut the door. It rattled the door, not to break it but to see what hinges had been used. The red hatchling hissed and laughed and stamped its foot because it had not learned yet how to take the measure of silence. The great black's head lowered. The eye was the color of burned malt. It came closer until Jon could count the tiny flaws in the cornea where dust had flown and stuck and been washed. He forced himself not to lift his hand. He forced himself to stand and do nothing when every boy in him begged to put his palm against that face and try to heal something that could not be healed. The eye blinked, curtain drawn, curtain opened. When the lid lifted again, Jon saw it. A dark speck reflected in that huge glare, a man in black with white at his scar and the stupid stubbornness of all the ghosts who had loved him. Something in that seeing finished a sentence that had hung without a period since the day the snow swallowed him and spat him back out. The dragon breathed. The breath hit Jon's face like summer. It lifted the hair at his temple. It did not burn. Behind him, he heard Davos exhale what might have been a prayer or a cough or a debt paid. "You have a look," Davos said later, when they were back on the boat and the wind had decided to behave again, if only to spite them. "You look like a man who failed to die again." "I asked a beast to be reasonable," Jon said, and reason answered. "It has a pitch I can hear now." He smiled without softness. "We'll write a pact. We'll write it only to remind ourselves of what we already agreed to. We will buy goats. The small folk will sing new songs that make old men angry. And someone, somewhere, will try to poison a beast to make a point. Then we'll have to point back, sure," Davos said. "But point with a hand, not with a sword." Poison came quicker than even Tyrion had bet. In the Reach, a lord whose father had died under dragonfire and whose heart had become a ledger line promised meat in exchange for safety and walked into his own court with honeyed apples stuffed into goats and a quietness he thought was cunning. The ash-spattered hatchling ate. The little glee he had at a sweet he had not known before withered inside him. He shuddered and lay down with an expression Jon had never seen in any creature and would have given a finger not to see again. The fire that came when it came was not anger, only animal convulsion. When it was done, the room where it had died was a black bowl and the Lord was a rumor left out in rain. Drogon rose that night with air that had been a friend turning traitor under his wings and went toward the Reach with a motion that was not speed so much as inevitability. Jon rode to meet him with Ghost as if his friend could outrun a verdict. Tyrion ran to the stables and sent men out to bring the Lord's wife and children to a place where the law was just enough to be believed. Bran's eyes went closed while his body stayed where it sat, and 1,000 birds learned a new path in the air. The castle that had tried to make poison and politics into synonyms woke with one word in its courtyards: fire. Men ran without weapons. Women stood very still and looked at their babies with questions that are always old and always new. Jon found the killing ground in the outer ward where it would be the least killing ground possible and stood in it. Drogon came down and the world went out and back again. The heat was a wall. The memory that moved behind his eyes was another. He saw a knife again, and at the same time he saw a boy at Craster's Keep who had learned the taste of cowardice and had spat it out again and again until he had no spit left. "Look at me," Jon shouted, because shouting into a storm is a way to live with your smallness. "Look at me, look at me. You know me, you know my smell. You know I am not the one who killed your child." The dragon did not kill him. He did not refrain from killing him out of any good quality in a dragon. He simply refrained. He moved that massive head aside and vomited a line of fire that drew a furrow in the flagstones like a finger in warm wax. It was not the castle he burned. It was the poisoner, where he stood with his ledger in hand in a chamber with no roof anymore, trying to pretend he still had sums to tally. He burned, and there was not even a scream. And Jon stood in the heat and told himself he would live with what relief felt like and not turn it into something uglier. After, when they had chewed through consequences as men chew tough bread and wash it down with thin wine, Tyrion took a pen and wrote the first lines of the new pact. He wrote them not in the soaring style of a man who thinks himself a character in a song, but in a sober hand that a miller could read. Said, "We will not kill your children. You will not kill ours. We will not take your sheep without giving you coin. You will not take our towers without giving us time to run. We will not raise scorpions in any field where wheat grows. You will not fly where children play unless you are flying over." Sam read it and smiled and said it was good to see a document not pretending it could tame men. Brienne took it and tapped it with a nail and said she would uphold it with a sword and without one. Davos eased it into a case like a man setting a child in a bed. Bran took it between fingers that had not opened easily in years and said he, too, would stand for it, and his voice was a raven landing on a clean branch. Sansa read it in Winterfell with a clear lamp and a cup of tea that had gone cool and did not mind. "We will abide by this," she said. "We will not pretend we like it, but we will abide by it." She sent riders to the shepherds in the hills and told them to count their flocks twice at dusk, and to send their sons to teach the dragons how to stand at a distance and accept meat without thinking of lambs. She called the moot and said words that sounded childish in the mouth of a queen because they admitted fear, and so they became the bravest words she had ever spoken. The lords who loved her because she had learned when to scare them nodded. The lords who only obeyed her because she had more numbers made their small calculations and found that they liked the look of crops not turned to ash when added to their sums. The world bent. It did not break. Ships under no honest flag began to burn wherever they crowded refugees into holds and stamped girls with iron. The stepstones, long the playground of men who love knives too much, learned a scalpel made of flame. The trade lanes opened, cautious as cats. A fisherman out of Pentos swore he had seen 3 dragons come down out of a cloud like punctuation and scatter a pirate fleet as if they had been writing a sentence whose grammar angered them. In the free cities, men who had made their fortunes out of human bodies learned to keep their heads down below decks and discovered that even below decks has a sky if fire chooses it. Children in lists stopped playing games where you had to hide under a bench when you heard a whip crack. In Old Town, Sam finished a book he had started long before he believed he would be allowed to, a history of how men make promises to violence and then must keep promises to mercy. He included a chapter on the care of dragons that was more about the care of men. In the Citadel, a boy with fresh ink on his chain read it with excitement and did not pretend he preferred books without stories. The glass candles burned for an hour each night and then went out because candles are candles, even when they are not. At Dragonstone, the mountains slept as mountains do, with dreams that last a century and are remembered as eruptions. The brood grew. The black-blue glider learned how to touch the surface of the ocean with the tips of his tail spines and not break the skin. The red loved nothing so much as to startle his siblings and then be chased and pretend terror, and then genuinely feel something like it when a gull took him in the ear and he discovered pain could be humorous. The green took to sitting with his belly draped over a vent and looking as if every wrong he'd ever suffered had been personally avenged by warmth. Another clutch appeared, at first only rumors and then shells hidden in rock where no hand had set them. Fire made flesh makes its own mathematics. The old tales were not careful with facts. These ones were not facts either. They were new tales. That was enough. Jon lived in the city and out of it. He took a small house near the river that had been rebuilt so many times it had a memory of the flood. He kept no servant because he had had too many lads call him something they meant as respect and meant as a question. Ghost took up the half the house that wasn't yard and guarded the other half jealously against cats that had always considered every house theirs. The dragonling, no longer a ling by any fair measure, learned to come when Jon whistled and to stay when he did not. He took meat from butchers who had learned to be less amazed. Jon did not ride him. The notion came, bright as a knife and twice as sharp. He let it come and go. He put his palm on the great neck and sometimes baby, though he never said that word, lowered his head into the touch and slept. The city learned to sleep under wings. There were nights when children woke crying and had to be told the boom was only a dragon moving air and not the roof falling in. There were nights when men woke crying and had to be told the roof had fallen in long ago and this was different. Every week someone set a trap that was discovered by a boy who did not want the world to go back to the last way it had been worse, and the boy was given a good knife with his name inked on the leather of the sheath and told to use it for cures not cuts. Every month a hunter in the hills shot a wild thing and regretted it because he had loved it before he knew he was pointing at it. Every season a ship that had meant harm was burned to the waterline, and the bones of the men who had sailed her sank to a quiet where the drowned gods are said to speak and had nothing kind to say. Sansa came to the capital once because she had promised she would and because the North honors its promises by carrying them to the end of the world. And she stood with Tyrion on the balustrade and watched the shadow pass over them, and both of them lowered their heads with the same expression. Gratitude that looks like exhaustion and victory for being alive enough to be tired. "Do you ever hate that it's happened this way?" she asked. "That governance is a series of bargains struck with whatever chooses to be bigger than we can use?" "Every hour I do not drink," Tyrion said, "and every hour I do. But if you ask me whether I hated the way it was before more, yes. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. Then we had monsters who insisted on thinking. Now we have a monster who insists on being a monster. There's an honesty in that." "Monsters are honest," Sansa said. "Children are too. Neither are kind without practice." "Then we will teach them," Tyrion said. "We will teach the children and we will teach the monsters. Or at least we will teach ourselves how to survive in a world where teaching is needed." Bran spoke less as the years moved through their motions, which meant his words were harder when they came. He dreamed longer. When he looked out from his moving tower, he saw men learning the rhythm of new fear as a beat to work to. He saw the forests of the far north reclaiming a little of themselves. He saw, once, a glimmer in the west where Arya had chased her horizon and laughed. Because when a girl goes looking for what is left of the world should be courteous and leave her a new piece to find. She came back once, too, and knelt in his hall and did not kneel in any other, and told him a story that made the men around him think her mad and him madder for smiling. She kissed Sansa's cheek and squeezed Jon's hand and told Gendry his walls were better than his lies now and left again before she could be attached. He let her go with every nerve calling to grab her sleeve and keep her. He had learned to watch without holding. That's all a king can do who means to be a person as well. There were still deaths. It is a poor chronicler who pretends they do not happen merely because goodness is within reach. A herd was lost in the west when a shepherd boy fell asleep under a willow with his flute, and the red hatchling found the tune irresistible and then found sheep even more so. A girl on the Rose Road was burned when a caravan panicked and lit fires to look brave. A baker in Flea Bottom burned his own shop by accident trying to keep a loaf from the rat that had taken up residence under his oven. And the dragon overhead was blamed by 4 men with slow wits and a need to shout. 2 days later those men were ashamed because the baker gave them bread anyway, and they spent a month helping him rebuild. The ledger of the world balanced itself in ways no one can love but everyone can live inside. At the last, when summer had started to point itself toward something that looked like a little winter, because the world does not forget all its old steps even when it learns new ones, Drogon rose from Dragonstone with a wing beat that shook out a shower of very old dust. He turned in the air for the pleasure of it, because to turn in the air is to say I can to gravity's face, and he went north. Jon heard him before he saw him. He had taken to listening for whether in the way trees talk to a man who has decided to forgive them for standing still. The air called through the alley. Ghost sat up and cocked his head as if to say, "If you are asking whether we are to have guests, you might have asked me." Jon stepped out into the yard and looked up into a sky that had brought him both the worst and the best of the stories he lived in. Drogon descended low enough that the wings brushed the pitch of a roof and sent a scatter of splinters into the air that rained down as confetti over 3 laughing children, whose mother would pick them out of hair and shirts with fingers that scolded and could not hide their delight. The dragon hovered above the throne room that was no throne room now and let his fire touch the broken floor the way a sparrow tests a branch. A seed, left in a crack by an old woman who put seeds places the way other old women put coins under pillows, felt the heat, woke and grew ridiculous as any miracle. Jon watched a green leaf appear where nothing green had grown since the day the roof had fallen. He laughed, and he did not know he was laughing until Ghost lifted his head as if to join in. Drogon came down to the yard. He settled all that weight as a woman settles a basket when her work is done. Jon went to him and put his hand on the old scar along the jaw where a ballista had once kissed him evil. For a long time they stood, man and beast, a plain thing to watch, so plain that the men on the wall looked away because it felt indecent to observe tenderness that owned no one. "Do you remember me?" Jon asked. He knew dragons remember, but memory is a private country for every creature. The dragons, I said, only that it remembered what it remembered. That was enough. For men, too, sometimes. They gathered that night in the hall that was now a hall for feasts that had more cabbage than meat and more laughter than any feast a king had ever thrown. Tyrion poured wine as if wine had hope. Davos told a joke so obscene the old gods covered their ears and the new gods asked for another. Sansa sat at Bran's right and cut apples with a knife that had done more unpoetic work than poetic in its life, and she fed a slice to the child of a mason who had repaired more memories than men. Gendry and Arya sat sideways on bench and bantered in a code only 2 people can invent together. Sam fell asleep with his head on a book and drooled and did not hate himself for it. Brienne stood and did not sit often enough and smiled at the sight of Podrick, trying not to flirt with a life that would only be half kind to him. Above them, in the dark that human lamps do not climb, the dragons slept on roofs because roofs felt like cliffs, and their breaths came and went like the old tide under a dock. A boy on the wall asked the man beside him if he would ever stop being amazed. "No," the man said, though he was already half asleep and thought he was saying something else. "No, not if you're worth your shoes." In the morning, the green leaf that had unfolded in the crack put out another and then another, so eager to be alive that it made a mockery of the stone around it. The city argued for an hour about whether to fence it in and decided, in a rare fit of collective sanity, to leave it alone. Children came to look and then went away to play, because living children spend wonder as easily as coin and know it will come round again if the store is to be believed. Men who had wanted a world without dragons found themselves grateful for a world with them. Men who had wanted a world full of nothing but found they missed the old clutter. And far out over the steppe-littered sea, a ship that had kept iron in its belly where people ought not to be stood under a bright sky as if daring it and then turned to the kind of cinder that makes other men throw their ropes into the water and swim for something better than the shore. The fire climbed the rigging like an idea going through a dim room, shaking men awake. A dragon turned on the wind like a thought too quick to catch. Said nothing. It needed to say nothing. Men looked up and learned to live under it. That was how Westeros was reclaimed. Not by a man on a chair of knives. Not by a house with a sigil that could make men pretend to be more than they were. It was reclaimed by the sky teaching the earth a different grammar, and by men remembering they knew how to conjugate it. It was reclaimed by bargains with beasts and with their own best natures. It was reclaimed by a dragon who had lost a queen and found, in the ashes of a throne, not a king but a garden. And it was reclaimed by the stubbornness that keeps the leaf pushing out of stone, and the hand that reaches out toward heat knowing it may be burned and choosing to reach anyway. By the time the leaf in the broken hall put out its fifth little hand, the city had given it a name without asking permission of anyone. It was the Black Garden, and the name made old men scowl and children grin and mothers tilt their heads in a way that meant they were measuring whether a miracle would stay. The floor there still held the rippled scars where iron had run and cooled. The green thumb rose between them like a jest the gods had chosen to keep telling. When the bells clanged for market hours, hawkers wove their calls around the garden, as if it were a street musician you didn't interrupt. Someone brought a small wooden fence and set it 2 paces away, and then took it away again because a fence made it feel owned. A seamstress came each morning with a bucket and watered the crack. Nobody knew who had told her to, and nobody told her to stop. Feeding dragons had become a craft. The countryside east of King's Landing hung with new shelters like low, airy barns, 10 by 10, slatted and open as confessionals. Boys called them dragon larders. A levy was raised, the scales, and you paid it in coin or goats, and for once the insult of a tax was softened by the oddness of its purpose. Ser Bronn of the Blackwater, who would always be Bronn before he was any sort of Ser and had never pretended otherwise, discovered that goats bred faster when they were fed oats instead of hope, and became a lord once more by building sheds in the Crownlands and leasing them to men who'd never owned more than a patch of dirt barely bigger than a bed. He whistled while his clerk scratched figures and considered what a man could do with a world that at last admitted its appetite. The High Septon came to look at the garden one morning in a plain robe and sandals that had worn through at the heel. The simple things are always the only things that manage to look like truths in King's Landing. He stood a long time with his hands tucked in his sleeves and his eyes on the leaf. A woman drew a little sign over her heart. He didn't rebuke her. That night, in a sermon delivered from a square of planks borrowed from a fishmonger's stall because there was no great September to preach in anymore and no appetite to rebuild one, he said, "The 7 made beasts and men and other things we can't name without pretending to be clever. When a thing flies over us, it isn't a sign of our sin. It is a sign of a world large enough to forgive us for how small we've made it. It wasn't doctrine. It was enough." Old Town found itself wearing its age proudly again, as old cities will when magic decides to treat them like an address worth remembering. Glass candles burned for an hour after midnight and went out not because men snuffed them but because everything that lives must rest. Sam turned pages and took notes while they burned, and once he pressed his hand flat to the table because a line of writing he had never written appeared between his own. It was not a clear line. It was messy in a child's way, and the language was not one he'd learned from any maester, and somehow he knew it was written by the breath of a dragon, the way Flame had once written words on a blackened sky for a boy on the stepstones. He tried to read it aloud, and all that came was a little cough and a note that was not a human note. He tried again. He stopped when he felt the heat climb his throat and smiled at his own foolishness and wrote in the margin, "Fire thinks in curves, not angles. Do not force curves into letters." A horn turned up in the vaults under the high tower, because of course one did when no one with sense wanted it. It was long and ridged and banded in red gold stamped with glyphs so old they might have been scratches a board god made with a nail. The gold was not what was interesting. The horn tasted of old metal and something like salt if salt had been made by burning rather than water. The archmaester who had argued against horns stood over it with a handkerchief folded 3 times on his palm like a man holding a dead adder. He said, "Lock it up in a box inside a box and throw both into the sea and then tell the sea to bury its shame." Another man said, very reasonably, "We should study it. Reason killed more men than anger in Old Town. It always had." Sam said gently, "We can study it by keeping it very far from mouths. A horn is only as clever as the breath that goes into it." Some acolyte tried anyway, because the world never runs out of boys who want to find out what pain looks like wearing their face. He took it to a side channel of the honey wine, and he took 3 deep breaths because a horn asks you for 3, and on the second breath his lungs burned as if they had turned into honey set over a fire, and on the third breath he coughed blood. The sound that came out of the horn was not a sound fit for ears. It was lower than that, a shaking that set the water trembling in a pattern that wasn't a pattern yet, and every rook in Old Town rose as if a dog had barked from a place between walls. A boy on a rooftop tripped and would have fallen if a hand had not caught him by the belt, only there was no hand, only air, and he sat very quietly for an hour afterward and would not say what it felt like. They put the horn away. The Archmaester wrote a stern page about curiosity, crossed it out, and wrote instead, "I want to be alive with my cowardice. And if that is wisdom, let it be a secret kind." Arya came with a wind carrying a smell that no one in King's Landing could name, which was how you knew she had been somewhere worth going. She came in at night and left early, and in between she found Gendry banging on a length of iron that would not admit that it wanted to be a hinge, and she stood in the doorway until he looked up and saw her and immediately pretended a fleck of grit had got in his eye. She walked over and plucked the grit out and flicked it somewhere the light wouldn't find it. "What did you see?" he asked, as if a story could be cut like a plank and measured. "Nothing," she said cheerfully. "That's how you know it was good. There was a line where the water forgot itself. It bent over its own back and called it sky. The sun carried its own double and dropped it and picked it up again. There were birds that never land. There was a fish that laughed. There was a man in a little boat who pointed at the west and said there's no land that way, and I said that was what I liked about it." She leaned against the workbench and breathed in, deeply, all the smells I missed: oil, smoke, sweat, beer. A world where the worst thing happening is a hinge refusing to change its mind. He handed her a mug and their knuckles scraped, and they both pretended not to notice their hands being as ungainly as they had been at 14. "Stay," he said, not like a plea and not like a command. "No," she said, just as kindly as he'd asked. "But I'll come back before the hinge learns politeness." Prince or Princess of Dorne. No one could agree on what to call the person with the turban and the soft, fierce voice who kept the water gardens without ever admitting to having inherited them. Sent an envoy with oranges and a letter. The letter said, in more words than that the sand did not burn easily and that if dragons wanted to lie on it and warm their bones, Dorne wouldn't say a thing, but if a dragon ate a child, they would. It was the sort of hard, sensible letter Sansa liked. She sent back apples that had grown under dragon shade and a letter that said, in fewer words than that everyone's children were everyone's business now. Between them they learned the politics of a thing larger than both. If beasts flew, walls had to learn to be invitations. Yara sent men to salvage. She called it salvation and meant both. Where ships burned under shadows, the Ironborn learned the new trick of dragging men out of water and laying them on decks that once would have been oarsmen's benches and beating their chests until they coughed. You have to teach an Ironborn a new habit 3 times for it to stick. The 3rd time a saved man tried to thank his rescuer in coin and was refused, he cried. A boy in the Iron Islands drew a picture of a dragon over a ship on fire and another dragon over a ship not on fire, and he took it home and showed it to his mother and said, "Which one is us?" And she said, "The second, if we mind ourselves." And he pinned it above his bed and grew up to hammer a nail straight when it was needed instead of a skull. There were still men who liked the old way. In the Vale, where men loved the word, just the way they loved the word mine. Someone put a scorpion on a shelf in a mountain keep and told 6 lads to keep it a secret. Secrets in mountains are like birds under domes. They find the smallest crack and turn it into a clamor. A stable boy told a girl he trusted, and the girl told her elder brother because she wanted to tell someone taller than the boy, and the elder brother told his father because he had learned to pick the right moment to have courage, and the father went to Bronzion Royce and swore by a god he had never been brave at before that the lads would not be named if the scorpion was, and Bronzion came down and his beard shook when he shouted, and every bit of bronze on his person seemed to ring with the force of the word fool. The scorpion went on a bonfire with a pig and 3 old chairs, and the smoke smelled like a tavern that had burned down while nobody loved it, and the lads, 6 of them, went home with straight backs that were going to stay straight for a while because they had not been named. In the capital, Tyrion wrote a note to the Vale that said simply, "Thank you for pretending to have sense," and then he wrote another to Gendry and said, "Send them hammers, because it is better if the hands that once wanted to pull a trigger learn to make the nails that will hold roofs on." The Red Dragon knocked a boy into a water trough near Stony September and broke his arm, and the village went quiet and then loud, and then quiet again because the boy's mother came out and said, "He's been running into things since he was old enough to stand." She sat on the step and cradled him and scolded him and looked up at the creature that had done it and did not hate it because hate would have had to go through too much wonder to get to her. Even so, a wrong had been done and a wrong wants an answer, and if you don't give it one it grows a second head. Tyrion rode out with Master Talbot, an accountant with rememberable hands and a face like an indulgent knife, and they set up a table and weighed injury in coin and meat and an apology spoken by a king's man in a square with a crooked tree. Jon came because the square had a crooked tree and he liked those sorts of places where mistakes were old enough to have learned politeness. He stood under the dragon shadow and said, "I'm sorry." He didn't say it for the dragon, and he didn't say it because of the arm. He said it because sorry is a thing that keeps the world from turning into a wound. They left coin and meat and a promise to keep the creatures high over places with children in them. The boy, whose arm was splinted and whose pride was unhurt, asked if he could touch the dragon, and Jon said, "Not today." And the red shook out his wings and gave the boy a little halo of warm wind, and the boy decided that was enough for the first time. In the mountains of Dragonstone, something newer than old broke. Eggs split with an efficiency that would have been terrifying if it hadn't looked so much like any other birth. The shells were not smooth. They were like a mosaic set by a drunk god, red slashes through black, veins of deep green like moss under ice. The first head was damp and ill-tempered and immediately sneezed and set fire to a curtain of cobwebs that had been waiting to be insulted for a century. The second took its time and came out in sections, pausing between strokes to consider whether growing was worth the bother. It was. The third kicked hard and rolled over the lip of the shelf and would have fallen if the black-blue glider had not scooped with his wing and caught the little fool with the grace of an older brother who'd been foolish enough to learn to be tender. The green set his chin on the stone and watched like a grandfather and pretended not to be pleased. The red danced around and squawked and tried to teach them to startle each other. Drogon watched and made a sound that wasn't a sound because sometimes pride in others is so large you can only carry it as heat. The pact was written into more than parchment now. You could see it in the paths through the air. The creatures found lanes the way men find roads. They flew over the sea where they please. They kept high over the Rose Road, and the children on wagons craned up to look and got told by stern fathers to sit down before they fell off. No scorpions appeared on the battlements of cities that wanted to keep their trade. In the north, Sansa sent herds into folded valleys and set bells on the lead goats, small, pleasant bells whose song was like a reminder to a beast that there were other kinds of music than the singing of their own blood. A letter came down from Carhold with a smear of old stew on it and said in the bracing way of Carhold letters that when the bell rang, sheep learned to bunch, and when sheep bunched, dragons lost interest. Count this a kindness. She sent back blank vellum and told Carhold to remind her that not every kindness had to be poetic. Bran dreamed. He did not go where he was not wanted now. That was a lesson he had learned late but had learned. He touched the edge of the island where Arya had found nothing and had loved it and heard a humming that was not the old humming of the north, which is the sound of cold remembering how to be cruel. It was a newer tune, something like a choir tuning itself, a million small sounds that failed to offend one another. He dreamed once of a place where stone had melted and then melted again and formed a crust like old bread, and in the crust there were long lines like writing placed by a slow hand with a shaking pen, and he smelled hot blood under ash and a kind of laughter that was not unkind. He woke and called for paper and wrote a note to Sam and said simply, "The mountain speaks in rivers. If you read a river, listen with your skin," and Sam nodded because sometimes the only answer to a madman's poetry is a librarian's compliment. There were men in Essos who did what men in Essos have always done. They saw a problem and tried to hire it to be their weapon. In Volantis, where braziers burn long and priests burn longer, someone paid a caravan of fools to trawl the ruins along the smoking sea and bring them a horn. They came back with a thing that had not been a horn before they got their hands on it and would have been happier if it had never learned to be. It was black as a regret and banded in red gold and sang when left alone the way some stones sing when you stack them badly. A girl of 13 took a breath to blow it and someone caught her wrist and said, "If there are gods, they will hate us if we do this," and that was enough to stop one calamity for one day. Drogon lifted his head on Dragonstone anyway and turned his face toward the east as if he had smelled something he had not smelled since a room went wrong, and Jon, who was eating bread with honey in a yard with Ghost asleep under his chair, put the bread down and stood and felt his heart borrow a beat from a drum not being played. Nothing came of it because sometimes men fail to make the mistake they want to. The caravan burned on its way back to Volantis because a dragon found it and mistook it for pirates. The horn went into a river, and the river made no sign of having noticed much at all. The Iron Bank sent a letter, precise and polite enough to be mistaken for kindness. It said that the scales were unproductive and that innovation had to be measured to be real. Tyrion wrote back a letter that took 3 drafts and no wine and said that counting goats was the new coin and that if the bank wanted to be loved. He knew they did not, but he wrote it anyway. They would open a window and let a little air in. He enclosed a copy of the pact, and a small sprig from the black garden pressed between the pages, and a figure that even a banker could respect. The tithe of ships burned under Drogon fire carrying human cargo, tallied out by port town clerks who had looked men in the eye when they told their stories. The bank sent back a reply that did not say thank you. It did change the rate of a loan to a fishing town on the narrow sea and sent 2 clerks to learn how goats work. Another leaf emerged in the hall, then a third, then 6. They were not a tree. They were something that would be a tree if allowed to be ridiculous long enough. The smiths offered to put a trellis up with iron arms that would cradle the green. A mason said no. Stone grows jealous when you remind it that it was once mud. They set rough stakes instead and tied fibers torn from old rugs to support a vine that behaved as if it owned the room. Children watered it with their own cups and told secrets to the leaves the way you do to extent branches when you are small and cannot keep a thing inside your chest without exploding. No leaf spilled a secret it was told. The garden grew by that loyalty. Gilly came to Old Town with little Sam, who was not little anymore and had the look in his eyes people get when they've learned to listen to a woman and a book and a kitchen, all at once. He stood in a room with glass candles and watched his father rub his eyes and smiled and brought him bread he'd bought from a man who tried to charge him double until Gilly had said, "He'll write you into a story and make you a villain," and the price had dropped to fair. Sam read aloud the chapter on feeding dragons without making them pets. Little Sam said, "Pets are the only thing I ever wanted and the last thing I ever want again." And Gilly smoothed his hair and told him that wanting changes its coat as you learn to hunt your days. Sansa held another moot. They met in a room hung with maps, and the men who came pretended not to have read them all the night before. She put her finger on a ridge where sheep gathered since the bells and said, "No torches, no arrows, no bravery you can't undo." She listened to men say that dragons were a southern weather, and to women say that their grandmothers had stories from a time when dragons had flown over the neck and snow had learned modesty. She listened to a boy with frost still in his hair tell a story about seeing a shadow and talking to it with his bones and being answered as quietly as a friend says your name. She did not dismiss anyone. She sent a barrel of apples to the crofter's wife who had rung the bells first and wrote her own note. "You rang the right thing." Tyrion brought in a tinker from the Stormlands who had made a whistle that changed pitch when you lifted your fingers in a pattern he claimed had come to him in a dream of a kite. They tried it in a field, and the red dragon cocked his head and came down so quickly that Tyrion had to fall backward as a breath of heat went over him. The whistle did not call the beast like a slave call. It announced its own presence like a hand above a crowd. Jon said, "Useful," and Gendry said, "Dangerous," and Brienne said, "Yes," and that settled it. They distributed whistles to the men who drove goats to the larders and told them to use them only for moving creatures away from children and toward fields where everyone had agreed they wouldn't mind a little scorch. A boy in Tumbleton used his once to pull a shadow away from a herrick caught by lightning, and all the town feared him for a week and then loved him for a year. In Bravos, where the water keeps its own counsel and men pretend to keep theirs, a certain congregation gathered in a room with no windows and argued about whether to turn dragons into a line of ink. The kindly man, if that was still his name, listened and did not speak until the argument ran out of breath. Then he said, "Names remain the most dangerous magic. This you have always known. They will not be brought to heel by a mark of sound on paper. Write whatever helps you live with death. Then go out and remember the taste of bread in your mouth and how your mother laughed when you were stupid." A girl with a face not her own smiled at the idea of bread and went to sleep and dreamed of a red leaf on a black floor and woke and forgot it on purpose, as you do with dreams that might pull you into living too brightly. Davos went to the stepstones with 3 ships flying the crown's flag, and he found a cove where a town had sprouted like a mushroom after rain, full of men who wanted to be smugglers but had learned that smuggling lives in the shadow of slave-taking and were trying to avoid the company. He talked to them like a man who had smuggled salt and onions and pieces of himself and knew how a man goes wrong by degrees. He showed them a ledger less cruel than any ledger had a right to be and said, "If you don't put children on boats, you may call your goods whatever you please, and I will call your debts something you can pay." He set a bell at the harbor mouth and told them to ring it when a ship came in with too many hands bound under deck. He gave them a whistle. He said, "Do not lie to me," and meant it so much that even men who lied as a manner of breathing felt their throats stop up at the thought. Jon lived as he had learned to. He got up with the light because it felt like a favor. He ran Ghost along the river when Ghost wanted to run and let Ghost sleep when Ghost wanted to sleep. He sat with the dragon when the dragon wanted him and left when leaving was a gift. He mended a saddle with clumsy stitches and tore them all out and did it again because clumsy is not a sin if you keep holy at the job. He grew a beard without intending it. He learned to whistle a tune that had come to him once when Drogon had breathed close enough to make all his hair stand up. He whistled it without thinking one morning, and the black-blue glider banked in the sky and came around and hung a moment he ought not to have been able to hang, and then went on. Jon laughed and stopped because laughter is a thing you don't want to spook away. He wondered if songs could keep a city from making mistakes and decided that if they couldn't, nothing could. And if they could, then they had work to do with every throat they had. Bronn's clerk married the seamstress who watered the garden, and they took a room half up a crooked stair that always smelled like onion and winter and happiness. On the night before their wedding, someone tied a little ribbon of green around the lowest leaf. In the morning, a child lifted it carefully away and stuck it in her own hair. Nd told the leaf a secret about how she had tried to steal a pastry and failed, and was glad she had failed because she loved the woman whose pastry it was, and that woman would have known. The leaf did not tell. A man in the Riverlands claimed Targaryen blood and waved a cloth the color of pomegranates and hired 6 dozen men who didn't know whether they were a company or a story. He marched to a village where the larders fed dragons and told the butcher to stop. The butcher said no. The man took a step and said something about fire and blood. The red dragon put his head down between the buildings and looked with one enormous amused eye at the man and snorted warm wind. The wind knocked the cloth out of his hand and flattened his hair and made him look like a boy trying to be tall in front of a mirror. He laughed and tried to make the laugh mean something. It meant he was embarrassed. He left because sometimes the world gives a man a gentle answer and he is wise enough to take it. The butcher cut him a slice of fatty meat and handed it across the block and said, "You look like you could use feeding." And the man chewed and thought about his father, who had been a stable boy and had never wanted him to march anywhere. The second clutch learned its own skies. One of them flew thick and low and liked to skim the sea with a wingtip and draw a wake behind it like a brush stroke. One of them loved rope. He stole it from docks and from tarpaulins, and in a wild week of annoyance took a whole net from a boat in the bay, and the fishermen shouted and threw bones and then laughed because the net came back 3 days later with a fish in it, as if the creature had wanted to pay and had not learned the exchange rate yet. The third preferred stone. He slept with his belly pressed to the dragonmont and his chin set on a ledge of rock, and could not be coaxed to do tricks for children because fountains are much funnier when you are a child and dragons don't much care for fountains. The older red tolerated them the way a teenager tolerates toddlers, fondly and with complaints that were mostly for show. The black-blue became even more himself, which is a way of saying he turned the air into something others might mistake for a toy and knew the air would correct them. A winter came in thin and left pleasantly. Men said the seasons were settling. Sam wrote that the world seemed to have remembered its wrist after a long fall and was flexing it and learning what movements did not cause pain. Bran sat under a leafless tree and watched the line of cloud that meant a dragon had just made a point. He thought of a girl who had once drawn a line in a dusty yard and told a boy he could not cross it, and then had smiled and made the line into a circle and put them both in it. It is a trick rulers forget and children remember. The first border is always the smallest one, and the only one you can enforce without losing yourself is the one that keeps your heart from shrinking. A day came like any other and brought a boy from Flea Bottom out onto the broken floor to stare up at the green. He had a crust of bread in his hand and a question in his eyes. He was 8 and had never stood in a place where a ceiling should have been and hadn't been put back. He had never seen a tree with no soil under it decide it wanted to be alive anyway. He looked at the leaf and then at the light beyond the old windows. He said, to no one in particular, "Why didn't they fix the roof?" And an old woman who had been a girl when the roof fell and had learned to tell the dark goodnight said, "Because the roof was the wrong part." And he nodded as if she'd told him where the butter was kept. Another day brought a fire in a brick kiln that got away from its men and leaped a wall and reached for a town that did not have time to be terrified properly. A whistle blew. Not a horn, never a horn. The sound rose and fell. The red shadow came down with a will. He took up the fire as if it were meat and ate it and coughed and blew sparks out of his nose and looked insulted at the taste of mortar. Mothers wept because their houses weren't ashes. Children wept because dragons had coughed. Men coughed because smoke is smoke, and Davos turned 3 pails into a joke and then made sure the pails were cleaned and turned upright, because the joke being finished did not mean the work was. There was a day when Drogon came to the Black Garden. He did not land inside. There was no room for a courtesy that large. He stood in the yard beyond and lowered his head, and the leaf moved imperceptibly in a wind that did not exist until the breath that was not a wind made it. For a long time no one moved. Even the gulls, those shameless thieves, felt the presence that had come among things and were silent. Jon walked out and stood where he had stood as a younger man and had asked an older creature to spare a world. He put his palm to scales and felt the warmth that answers other warmth and knows when to be a mirror and when to be a blanket. Drogon breathed out. It was summer in the hall. It did not scorch. It did not scorch because scorches are cheap, and mercy is an expense only the rich can afford and only the wise choose to pay. The green leaf trembled a little. The second leaf opened toward the breath like a hand toward a fire in winter. A child laughed then, because someone must always break the spell and turn it into a story, and it is best if that someone is small and earnest and wants to be excused for nothing. The laugh went up and out the broken windows and found the sky and became part of what the sky thought a city sounded like now. Gendry married a woman who cursed like a man from the docks and had hands too small for a hammer but large enough for sense. Arya returned and kissed the bride and said, "This is the one I would have chosen for you?" And the bride said, "He is lucky I chose him." And Arya grinned with a warmth that could have coo. "Get an egg if you left it close enough." She danced once. A clumsy, perfect turn that made children think she had practiced and made old men think their knees might remember. She left at dawn and left Gendry with a nail in his palm and a laugh in his chest that made work feel like prayer. Sansa did not marry and did not need to explain herself. The North has always understood that a queen can be wedded to her weather. She wore furs when it was cold and linen when it was warm, and her hair made the kind of statement that is not a statement. "I am not you." When an old man called her girl in a hall where she had decided how much bread 6 villages would be allowed to keep and had found a way to make it enough, she smiled the way winter smiles at men who say their own names too often, and he forgot to say it again for a long time. Children in the snows below the wall heard a new sound sometimes, a high whistling that was not a bird, and their mothers told them it was only wind that had learned a trick from the south, and they nodded and went back to the game of pretending wolves were dragons and dragons were wolves. Bronn grew old shrewdly. He kept his teeth mostly, and when he lost one he had a man make him a new one out of bone and put it in with a joke nobody wanted to repeat in polite company. He sat sometimes in the Black Garden with his back against a wall and counted quantities of goats without needing chalk. Once he took a coin from his pocket and dropped it into the crack near the root of the little vine and said, "That's for your trouble." And the next day the leaf was greener, though everyone knew that was the doing of sunlight and the bitchy generosity of plants, not coin. He died in his bed when he was ready, which is all any Sellsword hopes for after failing to die young, and men told 2 different versions of his last word and women smiled and did not say theirs. The faith settled into a way of talking about dragons that made peasants feel less poor. The mother loved children and dragons were not children, so that made them none of her business except as a thing she did not want to step on anyone. The father loved justice and dragons did not understand justice, so you did not expect it of them. You learned to make offerings to hunger. The warrior admired courage and told men to put away bravery when it risked making orphans. The crone held a candle up at night and told you where the scorpions were hidden. The smith put his hand on Gendry's shoulder and laughed at him once and said, "All right, make the hinge show you some respect." The maiden kept to herself because dragons have no use for maidenhood and maidenhood has rarely known what to do with dragons. There was a ship off lists that tried to outrun its story and did not. The new brood found it and taught it humility, and then found a smaller boat, a single-sailed thing, that had taken on a dozen souls more than it could carry and now sat very low at the stern. The black-blue glider hovered and tried to understand how to help without hurting, and settled for shadowing them until a larger ship came near and dropped a rope, and the men on the small boat cried, and someone began to sing a song that had no words, and the dragons lifted and flew and did not stay to be loved. Somewhere in a tavern that night, a man swore he had seen angels, and another man said, "No, those were just the world being outrageous." And this was the better truth. Old Town opened a small hall near the piers for men who had learned to ring the bells when danger approached. They hung the whistle of Tumbleton on a nail and told the story to boys who bored easily, and it didn't bore them. Sam sat in the back sometimes and listened to people he hadn't taught repeat his words back to him, but better, because words improve by being chewed. He kept writing. He wrote a chapter about how people who hate dragons often simply hate change, and how people who love dragons sometimes forget to love people. And he wrote another about how you feed the wrong things in yourself, and he crossed out most of that one because it sounded holy and he had learned to suspect holy. He wrote, "A dragon is a beast. A man is a choice. The difference is the way the morning feels when you've decided not to be cruel." Brienne kept standing too long in halls. She was as relentless as ever and softer where she had once thought softness a sin. She swore in 4 places she would never betray: to the queen in the north, to the king in the south, to herself when she took off her armor at night, and to a kindness that had taken more of her than any oath. Podrick learned to be ridiculous on purpose to make children laugh, and became a knight without making it into a song, which is the best way to become one. He had once had a lovely voice. It got better when he stopped trying to make it beautiful. He sang once under the dragon shadow for workers laying brick, and his song made their hammers find the right tempo for an hour, and the wall went up stronger than walls usually do when built by men who argue while lifting. John was older. He didn't feel old. He felt like a man whose hands knew what they were for. He found a white hair in Ghost and plucked it and then put it back because it felt like blasphemy, and laughed at himself for thinking a single hair could be a religious item. He stood sometimes in the Black Garden when no one else was there and said the name he never said aloud, just once, and let the leaves decide what to do with it. He didn't ask for absolution. He didn't ask for understanding. He asked to keep being able to get up in the morning, and the world obliged him more often than it had any reason to. Time turned and did not brag about it. A girl was born in Flea Bottom who would run messages all her life and never once failed to deliver, even the ones that bored her. A boy in White Harbor learned to carve small clever boats that sailed rivers and the mouths of old dogs. Woman in the Vale stopped drinking because she realized she wanted to remember the sound a dragon's wing made when it passed over a mountain in winter. A man in the Reach planted grapes in soil a red dragon had scorched and made wine that tasted like moral compromise and laughter. He put a picture of a leaf on the cork. The Iron Bank invested carefully and pretended the investment had not saved 24 small towns from starving over winter. A certain clever lord in the Westerlands built a school to teach his sons that goats were as important as gold, and his daughters that counting goats is a module of counting power. Someone killed a man in a back alley because men keep at that. Someone spared one because not everyone is doing the worst thing they can do all the time, and that is the whole reason anything worth saving is left. When winter came a little harder, men closed shutters and remembered to put out a bowl of water for the birds. Ghost came in and thumped himself down and turned the house into a house simply by breathing in it. The red dragon wrapped himself along the windward side of a hill and stopped a gale from carrying off a field that had been seeded late. A boy blew a whistle and it broke, and he learned all the ways the world refuses to follow rules, and he tied a bit of twine to the broken end and made a toy of it, and discovered, mercifully, that he didn't need magic because he had hands and friends. At the end of that winter, the Black Garden put out a blossom. It was small and white and looked like an apology that had decided to be a celebration instead, and had the right of it. No one touched it. A rat came at night and lifted itself upright in a kind of respect even rats know when they stumble on a thing that doesn't fit their usual lines. The blossom opened and drank light and closed again because you do not keep joy on your face every hour of the day if you want to have any left. A midwife came and lifted a corner of her apron and cried into it because she had once delivered a child in the hall under fire and had never told anyone that she had thought the world did not deserve what it had done for her. But now it did. Sometime after, when no festival was scheduled and no one had ordered any speeches, Drogon flew low over the city and the brood with him in a ragged arc that looked like punctuation, a question mark and then an exclamation. He circled once and twice and then lifted, and the shadow went over the harbor and the garden and the hill and the heart of the city and made everything under it briefly one thing. Tyrion was on a balcony with a cup of water. He would have preferred to be wine. He raised it anyway. Sansa was in a hall with a map where a girl from Deepwood Mott had traced the path a herd took around a hill. She laid a finger on the path and smiled. Gendry was bent over iron and Arya over a map that had nothing on it, and both glanced up and said nothing because sometimes seeing is the whole of speaking. Sam turned a page and felt a little warmth on the back of his neck and wrote in the margin, "We are being remarked upon." Brienne walked the wall and thought about how standing is a verb the body learns when it understands it must hold against weather and fortune. Davos was out in a boat with men who had never thought they'd sail under such a sky and told a joke about onions that did not improve with repetition and improved anyway. And somewhere a child, new to legs and delighted at the idea that the world could be stood upon, looked up into an afternoon rigged with wings and said not dragon and not monster and not even sky. The child said their own name and then giggled because names, at last, felt like something you could say under any shadow and keep for yourself. The laughter went up and out and over the water and the farms and the hills and the mountains. And if the trees in the godswoods took note, if the fish in the Blackwater felt a tremor along scales that had learned to read weather in echoes, if the old stones of the Red Keep found themselves warmed an instant by a heat that held no malice, if the bones under the Dragonmont rearranged themselves to make the new sleepers comfortable, if the glass candles flickered as if someone had told them a secret and they'd promised to keep it, that was between the world and its own ledger. Fire remembered, so did those who lived under it. It was not peace. Peace is a thing smug men invent to sell to other smug men. It was living. The daily treaty with appetite and mercy, with memory and work, with goats and whistles and bells and maps and leaves pushed through cracks. The pact held because men attended to it and because a dragon had lost a queen and decided he would not lose a world. And when, late, as the first hot days began to lift off the sea like steam, the blossom in the black garden dropped 3 seeds into the crack. No one saw it happen. A child found them later, small and hard and unimpressive. She took them in her hand and held them there because that is what you do with small, hard, unimpressive things that might one day turn into shade. She went home by a street that had learned how to be a street again and put them in a dish and told them her name. They would keep it because the best promises the world keeps are the ones no one is watching it make.